Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Wednesday, January the 19th, 2022. Sorry for my absence on Monday and Tuesday. I was out looking for an apartment. I haven't found one yet, but it's got to happen soon. So regular service may be interrupted again. Actually, I spent a great part of yesterday waiting in line to do my laundry. The washer and dryer, and there's only one in this building, were out for, I don't know, 7 to 10 days. And the clothing situation had become rather critical because I had no clean clothes left whatsoever. So yesterday I find out that the washer and dryer are working again. And so I go down and the washing machine is full of wet laundry and the drying machine is full of dry laundry. And there's no one there to pick it up or to move it. So finally, a couple appears, and I asked if they could take the laundry out of the dryer and put it on top, or to take it out of the washing machine and then put it in the dryer, which would then be empty. And they said no, they weren't going to do that because the top of the dryer wasn't clean. Well, it looked clean enough to me. So then I had to wait and wait and wait. And of course, when their time was up, when their stuff was ready, they weren't there. So I waited and waited some more. And finally, they showed up and opened the dryer and felt it inside and said, oh, and they put two more loonies into the machine and started the dryer again. I said, what are you doing? And they said, oh, it's damp. It's damp because you overfilled the washing machine. You were really going to make me wait through another cycle? And I had to stay down there in that tiny little laundry room in the parking garage because I was terrified that someone was going to take my place. So I had to wait through another cycle. And of course, when it was over, they didn't show up for a while. And so what should have taken, I don't know, about an hour and a quarter ended up taking up about 3.5 hours. Not a pleasant situation. And let's look at the chat. Hello to Anrun, Dan, Head McNack. Thank you all for your greetings. Hello, Jim Smith, who says, I know the entire chat breathlessly awaits the answer as to whether Revilo Oliver was the best man at Bill Buckley's wedding in 1950, as raised in chat. The answer a clear no. I would have thought that Brent Bozell would have been his best man, but I could be wrong about that. Brent Bozell was his best friend. They wrote a book about McCarthy together. Jim Smith continues, the wedding report in the New York Times Society page, subscribers only, plainly stated the best man was James Buckley, Bill's brother. Ah, yes. James Buckley was elected to the Senate from New York State in 1970, very narrowly in a three-man race. Hello to Chogokin 666. Hello to Dawn from Beyond. Hello to William Hicks, Emmett Kelly's Earth, Palcasso 88. Dionysus, hello. You guys should listen to Greg Johnson's review of BioShock. You can find it at Countercurrents. Okay. William Hicks says, Kevin, did you bring a book? Yes, I did bring a book. I was reading once again biography of Liszt, 3-volume biography of Liszt, which I try to do every year. Chokan 666 says, solution, set fire to abandoned laundry in machine unclaimed for more than 5 minutes. It's abandoned laundry. William Hicks says, I used to read Brent Bozell's column every week, liked it a lot. Let's talk about news not fit for print. Supposedly, we have a free press in my country of Canada, but that's a rather meaningless designation when the members of the media are almost exclusively temple prostitutes. I'm going to talk about a story in the Dorchester Review by Professor Jacques Rillard called In Kamloops, Not One Body Has Been Found. I should mention, full disclosure, that I know the editor of the Dorchester Review, Chris Champion. We used to work together at Alberta Report, and my writing has appeared in the Dorchester Review twice. Professor Roulard is a professor emeritus in the Department of History at the Université de Montréal. He begins, after 7 months of recrimination and denunciation, where are the remains of the children buried at the Kamloops Indian Residential School? I should point out, not to pat myself on the back, others have pointed this out as well, that I've been saying right from the very beginning, when this story broke, that there is no evidence whatsoever that there are bodies there. Where are the exhumations? Well, as I also pointed out, they're not likely to be exhumations because they're likely to be too embarrassing, and the Indian Reserve's making noises about how this would be disrespectful to the dead. But the Dorchester Review article continues, the Canadian press has just honored the children of residential schools as the Person of the Year 2021. The huge media story last summer grew out of the scanning of part of the site in the British Columbia interior where the school operated from 1890 to 1978. The so-called discovery was first reported last May 27th by, I can't possibly pronounce this nonsense, so I'm not going to, something First Nation chief Rosanne Casimir, after an anthropologist, Sarah Beaulieu, used ground-penetrating radar in a search for the remains of children alleged by some to be buried there. She is a young anthropologist and instructor in anthropology and sociology at the University of the Fraser Valley since 2018. Her preliminary report is actually based on depressions and abnormalities in the soil of an apple orchard near the school, not on exhumed remains. According to Chief Casimir, these so-called missing children represent undocumented deaths. Their presence, she says, has long been knowledge in the community, and some were as young as 3 years old. What a 3-year-old would be doing in a school is an interesting question, and I've never seen an answer to that. As far as the knowledge in the community, this is what they call oral history. In other words, tittle-tattle. From new research revealed at a July 15th press conference last year, the anthropologist scaled back the potential discovery from 215 to 200 so-called probable burials. Having barely scratched the surface, she found many disturbances in the ground, such as tree roots, metal, and stones. The disruptions picked up in the radar, she says, led her to conclude that the sites, quote, have multiple signatures that present like burials, unquote. But she cannot confirm that until the site is excavated, if it is ever done. A community spokesperson says the full report cannot be released to the media. For Chief Casimir, it is not yet clear whether the continuing work on the Kamloops site will involve excavation. The so-called Kamloops Discovery of 2021 created a major sensation in Canada and abroad. Based on the preliminary assessment, before any remains were found or any credible report made, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau immediately referred to a, quote, dark and shameful chapter, unquote, in Canadian history. British Columbia Premier John Horgan said he was horrified and heartbroken to learn of a burial site with 215 children that highlights the violence and consequences of the residential school system. Several other Aboriginal communities and media outlets then followed up with references to unmarked graves. And I should point out at this point, what does this all come down to? Even more federal money, gibs, being given to Indians, tens of millions of dollars for this reason alone. The amount of money given to Native Indians in this country just continues to expand and expand and expand, and yet their living conditions don't seem to improve for some strange reason. Back to the essay. On May the 30th, the federal government lowered the flags on all its buildings to half staff. Oh, yes, that lasted for what, 6 months? Later, it instituted a new holiday to honor so-called missing children and survivors of residential schools. Yes, note that, survivors of residential schools, like the Holocaust. Spontaneously, clusters of shoes and orange shirts and other paraphernalia were placed on church steps in many cities or on the steps of legislatures in memory of the little victims. Around the country, churches were burned or vandalized. Statues were spray painted and pulled down in apparent retaliation for the fate of the children. The statue of Queen Victoria in front of the Manitoba legislature was defaced and pulled down. Montreal's statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first prime minister, was knocked down, his detached bronze head symbolically rolling on the ground. Here, that last year, on July the 1st, which is Canada's generic national holiday day called Canada Day, in my own city of Victoria, the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald in front of City Hall was removed under cover of darkness. And on Canada Day, a statue of James Cook, the great explorer, in the Inner Harbor was knocked into the ocean as the police sat on their hands. In the wake of unsubstantiated claims by Aboriginal leaders, several media outlets amplified and hyped the story by alleging that the bodies of the 215 children had been found, adding that thousands of children had gone missing from residential schools and that parents had not been informed. The undisturbed sites even became mass graves where bodies were dumped in a jumble. The supposed news made the rounds in all sorts of media, tarnishing Canada's self-image and reputation abroad. These false reports induced the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to portray the situation as a large-scale human rights violation. The UN urged Canadian authorities and the Catholic Church to conduct thorough investigations into the discovery of a mass grave containing the remains of over 200 children, again, before a single verified body had been exhumed. Amnesty International is demanding that the persons and institutions responsible for the remains that had supposedly been found in Kamloops be prosecuted. The supposed perpetuators of this crime are also making excuses: governments, religious communities, the Conference of Catholic Bishops. In June, Pope Francis expressed his pain for the shocking discovery in Canada of the remains of 215 children at Kamloops, and in an exceptional gesture promised to come to Canada. Aboriginal leaders are demanding a formal apology, and some, including Roseanne Casimir, that the church provide more compensation for survivors. Yes, survivors. More Gibbs. To find out the truth about unmarked graves, the Canadian government made available in June an envelope of $27 million to identify and delineate burial sites and returning remains home if desired. By never pointing out that it is only a matter of speculation or potentiality and that no remains have been found, governments and the media are simply granting credence to what is really a thesis, the thesis of the so-called disappearance of children from residential schools. From an allegation of cultural genocide endorsed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we have moved to physical genocide, a conclusion that the Commission explicitly rejects in its report. And all of this is based only on soil abnormalities that could easily be explained by root movements, as the anthropologist herself cautioned in the July 15 press conference. According to another anthropologist, Scott Hamilton, who has worked on residential school cemeteries for the TRC between 2013 and 2015, one must be very careful with the use of ground-penetrating radar because the soil may have been disturbed over the years by sedimentary texture, culturally derived unconformities, obstructions, or voids. A project to test the soil with the same method at the Brandon Residential School in Manitoba, which began in 2012 and was relaunched in 2019, has not yet yielded any conclusive results. In a 2015 report, the TRC identified 3,200 deaths of children at residential schools. Surprisingly, it was unable to record the names of 1/3 of the children, 32%, or for half, 49%, the cause of death. Why are there so many nameless residential school students? According to Volume 4 of the report, there are significant limitations to both the quality and quantity of the data the Commission has been able to compile on residential school deaths. In fact, each trimester, school principals reported the names of students attending school to be funded by the government and specified the names of any students who had died. But in many cases, the report said school principals simply reported on the number of children who had died in the previous year without identification. The Commission included all these unnamed students in the total of student deaths. That means that student deaths could have been counted twice, both in the trimester report by the principals and in the general compilation with no names. The author of this essay goes on to explain at some length how everything that we have been told about what happened in Kamloops and pretty much everything else to do with the residential schools is bogus. For instance, The Kamloops School was founded in 1890 on the initiative of Shuswap chief Louis Klexlikan. The Kamloops Industrial School was run by successive generations of priests and brothers of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate and the Sisters of St. Anne from Quebec. In the 1950s, with approximately 500 children, the school was run by 4 English-speaking Oblates and 11 Sisters of St. Anne, according to the estimate by Frédéric Barriot, research director at the Montreal Centre for Justice and Faith. He believed that a typical residential school run by the Catholic Church had 2 or 3 Oblates, a dozen nuns, and often hundreds of children. I should mention that I've had a lot of dealings with Indian activists over the years, going back to the middle of the 1980s. And until fairly recently, they had lots of complaints about the Canadian government, but I didn't hear people wailing about the residential schools, which I find curious. Significantly, the Kamloops Residential School is located at the heart of the Kamloops Reserve itself, a fact that is never reported by Aboriginal spokespersons or the media. I commend to you this essay, which you can find at dorchesterreview.ca. So I was curious. What is the Canadian media going to do about this story? And the answer is nothing. It never happened as far as they're concerned. I did a search on both Google and DuckDuckGo. Nothing. Now, in the United States, this has been covered extensively. How about that? But the CBC ran a documentary a week ago on the Fifth Estate. Yes, the Fifth Estate shows how a BC First Nation is dealing with the traumatic discovery of what are assumed to be the graves of children, etc., etc., etc. I did find this from Native News Online. Former councillor Connie Leonard, they chose us. And this was published yesterday, written by Andrew Kennard. When Connie Leonard found out that the bodies of missing children had been found at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in Kamloops, BC, her body began to shake. They're gaslighting us. There's no evidence of this. None whatsoever. But who cares about the truth, huh? What is truth? Asked Jesting Pilot. Here's another story that the Canadian media has no interest in covering whatsoever. There were a lot of tears a few weeks ago when a bill, C4, was passed in the House of Commons with Erin O'Toole and Justin Trudeau getting together to proclaim how much they love the gays and how much they love trans kitties, the result of the sexual mutilation of children. All our political party leaders, except, I suppose, for Maxime Bernier, just love the idea of the sexual mutilation of children. Here's a story yesterday from Amanda Prestigiacomo at the Daily Wire. A new Canadian law called C4 outlaws so-called conversion therapy, which is defined in the law as any counseling or advising against transgender or non-binary identity or non-heterosexual sexuality, even if the young person or adult requests it. The new Canadian law, C4, bans any counseling that advocates for the Christian standard that sex is reserved for one man and one woman within marriage. It also potentially criminalizes any instruction confirming that human beings are created as wholly male or female from birth. Here's how the text of the law defines conversion therapy, which means a practice, treatment, or service designed to A, change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual, B, change a person's gender identity to cisgender, C, change a person's gender expression so that it conforms to the sex assigned to the person at birth, D, repress or reduce non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior, E, repress a person's non-cisgender gender identity, or F, repress or reduce a person's gender expression that does not conform to the sex assigned to the person at birth. Notably, influencing a person's sexuality or gender identity is only considered conversion therapy when it falls in line with biblical teachings. Influencing a minor or adult to be gay, non-binary, or transgender is acceptable. Yes, like the so-called GSAs, gay straight alliances. which are mandatory in many places across Canada. All schools, even private schools, must have them. And what are these GSAs? They are grooming parlors. Back to the legislation. For greater certainty, this definition does not include a practice, treatment, or service that relates to the exploration or development of an integrated personal identity, such as a practice, treatment, or service that relates to a person's gender transition, and that is not based on an assumption that a particular sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression is to be preferred over another. Those who disobey the law could face up to 5 years in prison. As highlighted by the Morning Wire, prominent Canadian pastor James Coates said the law essentially criminalizes evangelism. The Daily Wire's Matt Walsh showcased the law via social media, sparking outrage from conservatives. He tweeted, Canada's new law declares that you are guilty of conversion therapy and subject to 5 years in prison if you counsel your biological male child to accept his male identity. Mike Cernovich tweeted, it is legal under this law to convert children to alphabet people. People always said that that would happen. They were called crazy people using the slippery slope fallacy. Well, here we are at the bottom of that slope. Lennon Starbuck tweeted, so if your kid feels insecure or confused with their gender or sexuality, you can only get therapy if they convert to the identity that's anything but the biological norm. That's not therapy, that's conversion, coercion. Let's go back to the chat. Red Sulphur Cafe says news is as relevant as floating merds on their way to a processing station. Hello to St. Thomas Aguirre. Palpcasso 88 says Ottawa got 50 centimeters of snow. That's half a meter, which is about 19 inches. On Monday, saw a guy shoveling his driveway wearing a mask. So conversion therapy is allowed, but only in one direction, says Dr. Deadname. Yes, I'm reminded that the former Justice Minister, Attorney General of Canada, a native Indian activist, got a lot of, oh, isn't that sweet, when she brought a sexually mutilated child onto the floor of the House of Commons a few years ago. No one is willing to say that this is an outrage. Anwin says, it is probably, quoting, it is probably true to say that Edward VIII was pro-German, but not especially pro-fascist, not by the standards of the age, from after the Victorians by A.N. Wilson. Yes, well, has been reported that on the day that Britain declared war on Germany, the Duke of Windsor said, there is not a single drop of blood in me that is not German, which was certainly true enough, but it's a very strange thing to say, especially at that time. What else do we have here? Old Major, hello, says, the way everyone jumped on the residential school scandal shows how well the cathedral works. Dr. Deadname says, denim equals Canadian formal wear. I got kicked out of a bookstore, says Red Sulphur Cafe, for not having perfectly fitted mask. Shaniqua cashier refused to serve me and called security guard off-duty cop. Then some white thug showed up and got in my face. Jim Smith says Buckley's friend, who Kevin was referring to, was the father, who I believe was married to Buckley's sister. I recall a story about him that Brent Bozell was from Oklahoma, and Buckley went with Bozell to visit his hometown in Oklahoma, and they were in a bookstore or a stamp store. They used to have things called stamp stores. People would buy, collectible stamps. And so Buckley asked about something, and the shopkeeper said, get out of here with your phony British accent, which is pretty funny. Popcasso 88 says, Z-Man wrote a scathing review of the original Manchurian Candidate, said the plot was ridiculous. What do you think? I don't think it is ridiculous at all. It's one of my very favorite movies. It's absolutely riveting. Metal Mike to repeat, no, I haven't found a new place yet, but I am looking and I'm going to have to find it fast. James Buckley ran under the Conservative Party label, if I remember correctly, says Emmett Kelly's Earth. Indeed, he did. Indeed, he did. He later ran for senator in Connecticut and then was later appointed a federal judge, if I recall correctly. Seeing as the topic, number one, is Canada, universal mental retardation. I have more on this. Steve Saylor has a column in Takkies magazine. Rembrandt never left the Netherlands in his life, but the recent Rembrandt in Amsterdam exhibition at the National Gallery of Canada still managed to obsess in the style of our times over slavery, colonialism, and racism. The Ottawa Museum announced with a straight face, quote, "The Dutch Republic of Rembrandt's time had a very clear connection with the history of Turtle Island via contact between Indigenous peoples and Dutch settlers and through the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. Indeed," Saylor comments, "in the exhibition materials, it's Turtle Island all the way down." I'd never heard this phrase, Turtle Island, until 20 years ago, something like that. And I thought, this is obviously bogus. How would someone, say a Native Indian in Saskatchewan or Paraguay, even know of the existence of the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans? Rembrandt's life coincided with many significant developments in the early contact period with Turtle Island, Saylor says, but of course, as important as the First Nations of Turtle Island are to understanding Rembrandt in Amsterdam, Blacks cannot be ignored either. As the Globe and Mail explains, quote, "At the heart of the gallery's new Rembrandt exhibition, half a dozen portraits of beautiful 19th century ladies in black white collar dresses confront a collection of everyday stainless steel teaspoons recently assembled by Congolese Canadian artist Morija Kitenge Banza." The fundamental problem, Saylor says, facing art museums in the age of George Floyd is that history's designated bad guys, white men, produce vastly more of history's best art than did the official good guys, such as Blacks and New World Indians. To assuage the wounded amour propre of the presently privileged, the National Gallery put up a placard announcing that the historical shortage of old master paintings by Blacks is the fault of, wait for it, white men. Boo! So I was unaware of this path-breaking Congolese Canadian artist. And I did some searching and I came to a site called mcmichael.com, and they reprinted something by Kate Taylor of the Globe and Mail on December the 9th of last year. The 10 most stunning and startling artworks at Canadian galleries in 2021. Untitled, Discarded Slides by Susan Dobson. And it's a mound of garbage. In Slide Lecture, a standout show at the Ryerson Image Center, photographer Susan Dobson wrestled with the analog of all those obsolete art history slides. Why are they obsolete? And the Eurocentric pedagogy they represented. Her pristine photographs, pristine, recorded the round carousels, metal drawers, and paper envelopes used to hold these vast collection. Number 2 is actually a realistic painting, which is kind of shocking. Number 3 is called Sisypha by Victor Pilon. In October at Montreal's Olympic Stadium, performance artist Victor Pilon spent several hours a day, 6 days a week, moving 50 tons of sand from one pile to another. In these difficult times, the pointless task, a reference to the myth of Sisyphus doomed to push the rock uphill in perpetuity, became achingly poignant. I'm going to be talking about Lena Dunham shortly, and I'm going to refer to the incestuous dung heap of the art world. Well, here's number 4. From 1848 to the present, which is a work in silver and stainless steel. In the most hotly debated curatorial intervention of the year, the National Gallery of Canada introduced work by contemporary Indigenous and Black artists into its Rembrandt in Amsterdam show. Sometimes the post-colonial juxtapositions with the 17th century master were forced, and other times they were stirring. Oh, I get it. There's spoons. And what do you do with spoons? Well, one of the things you do is stir. Morija Kitenge Banza, the Congolese Canadian artist based in Montreal, filled a wall with everyday teaspoons, which he acquired through barter. In a layered work about the trade of enslaved people, and I'm looking at a dark blue wall, and there are hundreds of spoons in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 rows. Just stunning. Stunning. Number 5, Broken Circle by Ghazaleh Averzamani. In the midst of the Greater Toronto Art 21 show at the Museum of Contemporary Art, a delicate metaphor offered by a collection of misshapen spinning tops stood out. The Iranian-Canadian artist Ghazaleh Averzamani created the designs for the oddly shaped wooden tops by sketching shadows cast by a single top, but the grouping suggested a quiet celebration of humanity's great diversity. How can people write this without puking or bleeding from their eyes? Just junk, 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 junk. And it also as part of their Rembrandt in Amsterdam edition, someone put up a bunch of shelves and put junk in them. Yes, junk. Because, that's what you do in an art gallery. Okay, on the one hand, you got Rembrandt. On the other hand, you got junk in shelves, which is obviously just as valid and certainly more contemporary, certainly more important. Rashid Johnson, Capsule 2020 to 21. Powder-coated steel, plants, ceramics, rugs, fiberglass, shea butter, books, video, monitors, and glow lights. The facility is filled with plants, books, fiberglass, and shea butter sculptures, televisions, which broadcast videos produced by Johnson over the past decade, and grow lights. It functions as a brain mass that incorporates and connects autobiographical, intellectual, musical, historical, artistic, and literary sources. Most of the plants are housed in hand-built ceramic pots, made and decorated by the artist, with recurring images also present in his paintings. The stacked books contain topics that explore tensions and experiences relating to issues of race and class, such as The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual by Harold W. Cruz. As I've mentioned before, there is little to no Black history in Canada because as recently as 1971, when Canada's population was 22 million, there were 34,400 Black people in the whole country. Again, Canada, universal mental retardation. But back to the temple prostitutes of the Canadian media, a shocking story today from Amanda Connolly at Global News. Incels are targeting next generation of extremists online. Could algorithm reform help? No one had ever heard of incels until a few years ago. A man who styled himself the Supreme Gentleman, Elliot Rodger, killed a bunch of Chinese people in California for the reason that he couldn't get a date. And I suppose one of the reasons he couldn't get a date, despite his possession of a new $80,000 BMW and the fact that his father worked in Hollywood on the Hunger Games, is that he thought that it was women's duty to come up to him and put it to him rather than the other way round. 4 clicks on an incognito browser is all it takes for YouTube to churn up a video about, as the host puts it, embracing the idea of violence in a society that despises what it means to be a man. 4 clicks, and the column of recommended next views is full of videos touting the false benefits of ivermectin in the treatment of COVID-19. Yes, that's very radicalizing. I can see how touting the false benefits of this drug that begins with an I could lead men to violence. Well, the Instagram profile linked to by the host directs the viewer to an account promoting interviews about seemingly run-of-the-mill topics like traditional masculinity, fighting, and hunting. In between our posts, interviewing, promoting political figures linked to the far right, including those endorsing the violent mobs that attacked the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. Others call gender fluidity a delusion. Oh my God! And child abuse. While another urges the men in Kenosha to get ready and load your firearms on the day jury deliberations, as the Kyle Rittenhouse began. And it started with 4 words typed into the YouTube search bar: self-esteem for guys. There's a lot of gateways into radicalization, and often they're through fitness and health. And on platforms like YouTube, says Rachel Geese, author of the book Boys, What It Means to Be a Man. And I'm certainly looking for instruction on what it means to become a man from radical lesbian Rachel Geese. And the usual AstroTurf organizations are trotted out. Again, there's not a single voice in this lengthy story suggesting that this could be, shall we say, a tempest in a teapot. No. Global news will determine what the truth is. And if you disagree with global news's opinions, well, you're an incel and quite possibly a Nazi. Certainly dangerous. No question about that. But wait, we have more. From Global News, this time by Ashley Stewart, revealed how a web of Canadian doctors are undermining the fight against COVID-19. Seemingly baffled, Ontario Superior Court Justice Edward Morgan didn't quite know what to say when told only one of the 4 defendants for a hearing showed up. It was a landmark hearing for Ontario. 4 doctors, Roshan Killian, Mary O'Connor, Mark Trotzy, and Patrick Phillips, had been scheduled to appear to fight legal proceedings brought by the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario late last year. You see, because these 4 physicians didn't agree with the approved experts, professional action was being taken against them by the body that regulates them. And that's a good thing, because only Global News and the approved experts have access to the truth. Israel Levant found this video, and it comes from Quebec, because of course, with some kiddie show with some woman who appears to be in her 30s talking to kiddies who appear to be a boy and a girl 6 years old. Are you vaccinated? Yes, we both have 1 dose. Are you in favor of mandatory vaccine? Oui, they say. It looks like I drill them, says some other woman. What should we do with the people who don't want the vaccine? The blonde woman asks. What we should do with them? We should call the police. Oui, says the little boy. If they don't have the vaccine, it could make a lot of people in danger, says the girl. So like what the government does right now, we should cut everything from them, little by little, until they submit and get vaccinated. It looks like we got some future politician here, says the blonde lady. What a disgusting country Canada has become. Disgusting and contemptible. And let's move on to that story. We're seeing a sea change here. The efficacy of the vaccines, even with the 3rd dose, has been found to be somewhat wanting. So we have Boris Johnson saying that he's going to get rid of all restrictions by what, February? This is from Chris Herholt at CP24. Ontario reports highest daily COVID-19 death toll in nearly 1 year. Yes, strangely enough, during the cold and flu season, where people are likely to suffer fatal heart attacks while shoveling their driveway or sidewalk. But let's hear from Chief Ontario Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Kieran Moore. His office is checking whether deaths are causative or associated with COVID-19 through the death certification process. Golly, why weren't we doing this 2 years ago? Because 2 years ago, we could say that every death was the direct responsibility of Boris Johnson or Donald Trump or Jason Kenney or Doug Ford. That's why. And let's look at the latest numbers. Of Wednesday's 5,744 new cases confirmed through PCR testing, the Ministry of Health said 186 involved partially vaccinated people, 569 involved people with unknown vaccination history. 4,109 involved fully vaccinated individuals, and only 186. Only 880 involved vaccinated people. You see, you want to play the ratio game? Both in terms of hospital admissions and ICU, well, the ratio is turning hard against double and triple vaccinated people. And I predicted, I think it was on St. Patrick's Day 2 years ago, that when this is all over, when perhaps we can finally get to grips with the devastation that this panic has caused, the destruction of society and the economy, and scaring everyone to death, the authorities are going to pat themselves on the back and say, heck of a job, which is precisely what is happening. Even in Ontario, again, this is Chris Fox of CP24, Ontario will allow in-person dining to resume at 50% capacity at the end of the month, sources. Glimmers of hope, says Health Minister Christine Elliott. But the several of the experts who have been spewing panic porn for 2 years, no, it's too soon. It's too soon. We can't give up on the lockdowns and the masks and the rest of us, because people will ask the question, why did we do this in the first place? And yes, unvaccinated cases in ICU, 185 in Ontario, partially vaccinated 18, fully vaccinated 224. In hospital, but not the ICU, unvaccinated 770, partially vaccinated 174, fully vaccinated 2,044. And we have the CEO of Pfizer saying 2 jabs they're not helping you at all. Oh, okay. Then what exactly was the point? This is from Issues and Insights editorial board today. According to the latest numbers from the CDC, more Americans have died with COVID since President Joe Biden took office than did in the year before under Donald Trump. CDC data show that as of January 17, there have been a total of 850,575 deaths in the U.S. related to COVID. On Trump's last day in office, that number was 424,409. That means 426,166 COVID deaths have occurred so far since Biden took office, with the number currently trending well above 1,000 a day. This is a stunning rebuke, not just of Biden, but of everyone who went around blaming Trump for every single COVID death that occurred on his watch. Biden and others repeatedly insisted that if Trump had only done things such as accelerated testing and contact tracing, responded faster to the pandemic, pushed mask mandates, the country would have avoided the calamities of 2020. Yet despite Biden's solemn pledge that he had a plan ready to go that would fix those errors and bring an end to COVID, none of it worked. The virus has spread further and faster than ever since Biden put his plan into effect. Biden himself now claims he was caught off guard by the new, more transmittable variants, which in itself is a horrible admission of failure, given his claim that fighting COVID would be his top priority. More recently, he even switched gears to say that the federal government can't be expected to solve the problem. Biden's failure is even more glaring when you realize he had benefits Trump lacked. 3 vaccines had been approved when Biden took office. There were more and better treatments available, and the new strains have proved less lethal than the original virus. Biden is also guilty of overselling the efficacy of vaccines and mask mandates, neither of which has slowed the spread of the disease. In fact, there were 1.4 million new reported cases in one day this month, which was more than 6 times the peak last winter. In many ways, Biden's plan made things worse. He recklessly wasted time with divisive and illegal vaccine mandates that did little to accelerate the rate of inoculations. He butted the government into the delivery of new treatments, which created needless bottlenecks bottlenecks, he failed to address regulatory hurdles at the FDA that kept additional tests off the market. And there is a piece at unheard.com, that is UNHERD, by Vinay Prasad, called "We Need to Talk About the Vaccines." And he is Associate Professor of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco. He is a practicing hematologist and oncologist and author of more than 300 peer-reviewed publications. So I suppose one could justifiably call Dr. Prasad an expert, but he's not the right type of expert. He begins, last week, a group of scientists, doctors, and academics published an open letter calling on Spotify, quote, to take action against the mass misinformation events, oh, boo, which continue to occur on his platform, unquote. Specifically, they were objecting to two recent episodes of Joe Rogan's podcast in which he interviewed the prominent vaccine skeptics, Doctors Peter McCullough and Robert Malone. By allowing the propagation of false and societally harmful assertions, Spotify is enabling its hosted media to damage public trust in scientific research. I wonder whether these doctors, or doctors so-called, most of them aren't doctors, who signed the open letter have heard of the replication crisis. Rogan is not a scientist, and like everyone else, he has his biases, but he is open-minded, skeptical, and his podcast is an important forum to debate and dialogue. It is not enough, moreover, to simply dismiss Malone and McCullough as conspiracy theorists. They are controversial and polarizing figures, but they do have real credentials. Malone is a physician who has worked in molecular biology and drug development for decades, while McCullough was, until recently, an academic cardiologist and researcher. Both speakers made accurate and useful points on Rogan's podcast, as well as unsupported, speculative, alarmist, and false ones. The correct way to deal with incorrect ideas in biomedicine, if they arise to the level of prominence that warrants rebuttal, is to rebut them. The claim, the risks of mRNA vaccination are under discussed and boosters should be debated. I believe they are correct in these sentiments, Dr. Prasad writes. In April 2021, the first reports of myocarditis were noted in Israel, with the majority of cases occurring in young men who had recently received an mRNA vaccine. Since then, the evidence for vaccine-related myocarditis has grown. We know now that boys are more likely to be affected than girls. We know that Moderna has higher rates than Pfizer. We know that dose 2 causes more myocarditis than dose 1. The precise estimate of risk is now thought to be between 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 6,000 for males in the target range, roughly age 12 to 30, and researchers have shown that the CDC's method to study this underestimates myocarditis risk. Such concerns are not limited to the fringe. Marion Gruber and Phil Krause, the former director and deputy director, respectively, of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, resigned last autumn over White House pressure to green light boosters. Paul Offit, a prominent vaccine advocate and director of vaccine communication at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, recently told The Atlantic that he advised his own 20-something son not to get boosted. Other nations are taking the myocarditis concern seriously too. Several have banned or discouraged the use of Moderna in young men. Others advise 2 doses spaced further apart, and some have held off on a second dose entirely for younger age groups. It is perfectly valid to question the wisdom of boosters, at least in young people, though I do think, Dr. Prasad says, they are beneficial for older and more vulnerable people. And, let's hear from Australia, the prisoned island. This is from Kane at Citizen Free Press. Dan Andrews says booster shots will soon be mandatory. Yeah, it's not exactly a surprise. Got to eliminate the control group, which is what this is all about. It's a panicked reaction. Let's go to Steve Kirsch's newsletter. The narrative is falling apart piece by piece. Here are some narrative pieces that have been falling apart that were recently brought to my attention. Here are the 4 new truths. The vaccines make you more likely to get COVID. 2, the vaccines, well, he makes a claim about their safety. 3, cloth masks don't work. 4, kids shouldn't have booster shots. Top World Health Organization scientist finally admits that kids shouldn't get boosted. And let's see if there's anything new at Eugipius's Substack. The vaccinators will never stop vaccinating. Moderna CEO Stéphane Bancel discusses his plans for continued vaccination in the post-corona world. The vaccinators are deranged lunatics, and whatever happens with corona, we now face a prolonged multi-year struggle to retain control of our bodies and our bloodstreams. This is what I get from COVID-19 What's Next, a World Economic Forum. Oh, yes, the World Economic Forum. And you know, they have our best interests at heart. Panel discussion featuring Moderna CEO Stéphane Bancel. Like everything produced by the WEF, it's stultifying, boring, and terrifying all at the same time. Below the fold, I've transcribed the key moments for you, but the takeaways are simple enough. Moderna, just one of multiple pharmaceuticals eager to exploit our new vaccine mania, are expanding their manufacturing capacity to produce as many as 6 billion mRNA vaccine doses per year. Moderna will have an Omicron-specific vaccine as early as March, and they won't be the only ones. The compliant triple jab can look forward to having their fully vaccinated status revoked once again. Moderna are working in close collaboration with Dr. Fauci's team and with public health experts to develop an annual combined mRNA flu, RSV, and corona vaccine to reduce so-called compliance issues. The industry more broadly has targeted about 20 pathogens for vaccine development from Zika to Nipah, with a view towards being able to rapidly deploy mRNA vaccines against future virus threats. The vaccinators are a great sword of Damocles over our heads. As I type this, they are scouring the earth for the novel pathogens their products require, and they, together with their bureaucratic and academic allies, will do their level best to call into being new pandemic scares and vaccination campaigns whenever possible, perhaps every flu season. And again, this is from the Substack of Eugipius, EUGYPPIUS. And let's move on to Alex Berenson and his Substack, Unreported Truths. Expect Fauci to retire this year. And just like that, England went to Plan C, virus gonna virus, already playing in Florida and most red states, coming soon to Israel, Europe, and a blue city near you. Expect great ratings. And he had a fascinating piece about, the shares of Moderna and BioNTech are cratering. If you missed last night's story, Pfizer made a veterinary vaccine that killed thousands of calves in a horrible way that I don't know that I want to describe. Even after pressure from Germany caused Pfizer to stop selling the vaccine there, the company kept selling it elsewhere. A top Pfizer official told British farmers it was safe to use and that other factors were likely. And remember how health authorities said serious vaccine side effects always will be seen fast? Turns out that's not true, as Pfizer and its veterinarian chief executive should know better than anyone. In 2010, German scientists found that a Pfizer veterinary vaccine to reduce diarrhea in cows caused a fatal bleeding disease in their calves. Even after pressure from Germany caused Pfizer to stop selling the vaccine there, the company kept selling it elsewhere. A month later, Pfizer stopped selling the vaccine. European regulators later found it caused a 1 in 6,000 risk of the bleeding disease. For a prophylactic measure such as vaccination, this figure was considered unacceptable for a potentially fatal disorder, the regulators found. The risk of COVID vaccine-induced myocarditis, which can be fatal in young men, is now estimated at somewhere between 1 in 2,000 and 1 in 3,000. Apparently, the rules are stricter for cows. 6 weeks after the final dose is plenty of time to discover serious vaccine side effects. 2 months is more than adequate. 3 is unnecessary. Both before and after the mRNA COVID vaccines were authorized in 2020, regulators, politicians, and the media insisted on this point. Long-term safety data were not necessary for authorization because vaccine side effects happen and are caught fast. According to the CDC, side effects generally happen within 6 weeks of receiving a vaccine dose. Thus, the FDA was actually being conservative when it told Pfizer and Moderna to follow at least half the people who had received the second mRNA dose in their clinical trials for 60 days, vaccine advocates said. At an online conference in October 2020, Dr. Peter Marks, the agency's top vaccine regulator, said he believed 2 months was a reasonable standard given the severity of the pandemic and the rarity of long-term vaccine side effects. That standard meant that fewer than 20,000 people who received mRNA vaccines would be tracked for 2 months or more for vaccines that have now been given to more than 1 billion people worldwide. In 2006, farmers in Germany began seeing calves die horribly. Between 10 days and 3 weeks after their birth, the calves would begin bleeding uncontrollably from their eyes, ears, and even their skin. Farmers called the illness bleeding calf syndrome or even blood sweating. The disease spread from Germany to other European countries, killing up to 15% of calves at some farms. Thousands died. Scientists found that the bone marrow and blood cells of the calves had been destroyed. They called the disease bovine neonatal pancytopenia. As the outbreaks worsened, scientists, veterinarians, and farmers raced to unearth the underlying cause of the illness. Could it be breed specific? Perhaps it had something to do with the feed the cows received, or maybe an as yet unknown bacterial or viral infection. The answer was none of these. Meticulous examination of the records of the calves and their mothers or dams revealed that dams who had received multiple doses of a vaccine called PregSure BVD were far more likely to have calves who suffered the blood sweats. Calves who received colostrum, the pre-milk fluid that cows and other mammals make before producing breast milk from vaccinated dams, also had a higher risk. Who made PregSure BVD? Pfizer, through its Pfizer Animal Health Group, which Pfizer eventually renamed Zoetis and spun out as a separate company. PregSure BVD was designed to prevent the transmission of bovine viral diarrhea from dams to calves. It was an inactivated vaccine. That term means the vaccine contained the actual virus, which had been damaged to prevent it from replicating. And yes, so we know the rest of the story, that Germany said, you can't sell this anymore because it is tremendously dangerous and results in the death of many calves and obviously great losses to farmers, but Pfizer continued to sell it in other countries. Let's take a look at William Briggs's blog. He is, as you know, the statistician to the stars. And his latest post, CDC data, up to 90% or more of Americans already infected. That's the number of daily infections. He has a graph here reported to the CDC, which they mistakenly call cases, but let that pass. The bump up is, as you've heard, caused by the ominous Omicron. More infections are being reported now than ever before. Of course, testing is now at the highest rates ever, too. Some 3 million tests each and every day and increasing. The testing is asinine, but the soaring infections are to be celebrated. It's terrific news. I mean it. Here's why. Because up to 90+% of Americans have already been infected with the corona doom one way or another. Once that figure reaches 100%, surges in deaths should subside to background levels like flu, and any remaining justification for declaring a crisis or emergency evaporates. These are the CDC's own numbers, not mine. For some reason, the CDC's report estimated COVID-19 infections, symptomatic illnesses, hospitalizations, and deaths in the United States made only a minor splash, or more like a faint ripple when it was released last fall. But it should have been trumpeted far and wide for the bright picture it painted. First, do you recall all those panic if you don't have symptoms headlines from 2021? Fretting doctors fretted that many didn't even know they were infected, or that many mistook their doom infection as cold or allergies. They wept that this was awful because it meant people wouldn't panic to the level required. And Mary Harrington has a good piece, as always, in Unheard, called Boris is Our Sin Eater. In the 19th century Welsh marshes, when someone lay on their deathbed, folklore reports that it was usual to summon a person known as the Sin Eater. This person would place a plate of salt on the dying person's breast, then a piece of bread on the salt. Then, as a witness described in 1852, the sin eater muttered an incantation over the bread, which he finally ate, thereby eating up all the sins of the deceased. Today's sin eater is yesterday's cake eater, the prime minister who not long ago was being castigated for not imposing lockdown rules swiftly enough and is now being berated for never really believing the rules. Meanwhile, no one respectable wants to look at whether the rules he imposed with overwhelming public support were themselves worth the price. The rules were harsh, and the number 10 Downing Street breaches were numerous. Socially distanced drinks, boozing on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral, leaving in Christmas parties, cheese and wine. The list goes on, but the minutiae are less important than the cumulative sense that the government, presided over by Boris Johnson, carried right on with normal, sociable working life, while the rest of the country dutifully took the lockdowns literally and endured a self-imposed state of alienation, isolation, and misery. Ah, yes, because Dr. Neil Ferguson said so, and he's never been wrong before, not once. He's never been disastrously wrong frequently, pretty much every time that he's ever released a prediction based on his black box model. Let's go to dailyskeptic.org. 2 new science papers cast further doubt on human contribution to climate change. Government announces end of pandemic restrictions, including mask mandate from January the 26th. But the mayor of London says, no, you gotta still wear the masks because I'm the mayor of London. Because just like terrorism, mask wearing is just one of the prices one pays for living in a major city. Royal Society report, big tech should not censor dissent. Lockdown Musical explores the profound questions. What makes a life worth living? Does a Scotch egg really constitute a substantial meal? That's not a joke, by the way. That was a genuine controversy in Britain, whether a Scotch egg, which is disgusting confection, but is popular in Britain, whether it constitutes a meal. How we know that official COVID deaths are overestimated. And this is from Noah Carl. I've written before about the overestimation of the pandemic's death toll in Britain. If you compare the official number of deaths with COVID on the death certificate to the number of excess deaths since March of 2020, you find the latter is about 20% lower. And due to population aging, even that figure is an overestimate. Yes, and he explains how the data show that deaths have been overestimated. Lockdown skeptics were pilloried, sacked, and canceled, but now people agree we were right. But as Tom Wolfe pointed out years ago, one doesn't want to be right too soon. He did a delightful illustrated essay on that subject. Leaked Department of Health memo warns ministers that NHS vaccine mandate may not survive judicial review as vaccine effectiveness falls to 0. And let's go back to the chat. I'm going to be talking about Lena Dunham in just a minute. Lena Dunham, you all know her, you all love her. Let's see. Red Sulphur Cafe says Christians were able to manage their own affairs under the millet system in Ottoman times. Can we say the same in today's Amriqua? William Hicks says, aren't they going to be reducing the COVID deaths in U.S. by 75% due to the died with versus from factor? No sleep till Breezewood, PA. Hello, says, just combine the meds for maximum cocktail, I guess. Dr. Deadname jokes, this here is a 44 Pfizer, the most powerful vaccine in the world and could blow your spike proteins clean off. Hello to Gamions, who says poor calves. Hello to Don Willis and Tom Anderson. Respectable commenting name says, I thought Scotch eggs were soft-boiled eggs wrapped in sausage and herbs and fried. That's not a confection. I don't know. I'm going to call it a confection. They're going to stand by the 6th, 7th, and 8th boosters like they were NPR backing up proven repeated liar Nina Totenberg, says respectable commenting name. How persists is not a proper dinner without the KMG show in the background. My family agrees. Why, thank you so much. Red Sulphur Cafe says, notice they don't report regular flu deaths. Emmett Kelly Zer says, perhaps Global News should change its name to Gnostic News. What? Okay. Wait, we're supposed to approach women? Asked Dionysus. Why didn't someone tell me? I've read Elliot Rogers, what his manifesto and his diaries, and they're just absolutely shocking. It's just the idea that a fellow could be so out of touch with reality. Part of Elliot Rogers' problem, a big part of his problem, was that he fell between two stools, as they say. His father was British and his mother was Chinese, but his father abandoned the family, and he was raised in what you could call a Chinese milieu by his mother and her Chinese mother. And I learned from the diary that play dates are real. I always thought that was a rather malicious joke, but they are in fact real play dates. Because you can't have children, going up and knocking on someone's door and saying, "Can Billy come out to play?" Or you can't have a bunch of boys just sort of assemble in the park to play some game. I know it sounds shocking, but that was routine in the many generations ago when I was a boy. Jellied eels, Scotch egg, vomit, says Chogokin 666. Don't forget whelks. Don't forget whelks, which are an actual thing as well. There is a famous unfinished novel by an Austrian writer called Robert Musil, and it is called The Man Without Qualities. Lena Dunham is a woman without qualities. She has no redeeming characteristics at all. She has no talent, no imagination, and yet she was sold to us as the voice of a generation, the voice of her generation. How did this come about? Well, let's take a look at her life. I'm going to read from Wikipedia here. She was born in 1986 and is described as an American writer, director, actress, and producers. In 2013, Dunham was included in the annual Time 100 list of the most influential people in the world. No, she is simply a characteristic specimen of the incestuous dung heap, which is the modern art world or intellectual world. She was born in New York City. Her father, Carol Dunham, is a painter, and her mother, Laurie Simmons, is an artist and photographer, and a member of the pictures generation, known for her use of dolls and dollhouse furniture in her photographs of set-up interior scenes. Her father is Protestant of mostly English ancestry, and her mother is Jewish. Dunham has described herself as feeling, quote, very culturally Jewish, although that's the biggest cliche for a Jewish woman to say, unquote. She attended Friends Seminary and then St. Anne's School in Brooklyn, attended the New School before transferring to Oberlin College. She made a bunch of obnoxious YouTube videos. Let's see Lena Dunham naked in public or in a bikini brushing her teeth in the public fountain at Oberlin College. Is that sanitary? Dunham was shocked by the backlash and decided to take the video down. There were just pages of YouTube comments about how fat I was or how not fat I was. She said, "I didn't want you to Google me, and the first thing you see is a debate about whether my breasts are misshapen." Well, there's no longer any debate about that. This woman is connected. She is so connected that when she was a teenager, the New York Times ran a news story about some themed party that she had thrown. Yeah, how about that? So she makes a film, a mumblecore film in 2010 called Tiny Furniture, which is for some reason in the Criterion collection. Oh, she wins awards. And then she gets a deal at HBO where, essentially Lena Dunham says, I'm going to make an HBO series about me. And tangentially, some other women I know. And make no mistake, despite what the Hungarian name surname that she gives herself, and the fact that her parents in the show Girls were supposedly from Michigan, no. A family like hers could only be from New York City. So yeah, so you're going to make a comedy show on HBO, but you don't know how to write jokes. Oh, we'll bring that Judd Apatow in to write jokes for you. How many people get a deal like that? Huh? As I say, this woman is connected. The show never got very good ratings, but of course, since she was the voice of a generation, it was considered mandatory watching. The show it's pustulant. It's just pustulant. And I'll mention again the episode where she meets some hunky doctor who's like 40 years old and rich, and he has this fabulous pad, and he runs into Lena Dunham in, I don't know, a bagel shop or something like that, where she's creating a fuss about nothing as usual. And hey, why don't you come over to my fabulous pad and I'll cook us steaks and have sex with you? Because that sort of thing obviously happens to Lena Dunham, that an extremely handsome, virile man, a professional and rich, would just, oh, I've got to have that Lena Dunham. And I was watching the show and I thought, okay, the twist. I'm waiting for the twist. And the twist would be that Lena Dunham is going to be alone in her squalid bed, fapping away, because the whole thing has been a fantasy. And there was no twist, because we're supposed to believe that that sort of thing could happen to Lena Dunham. In late 2012, Dunham signed a $3.5 million deal with Random House to publish her first book, which was an essay collection, because of course, called Not That Kind of Girl. A young woman tells you what she's learned. Ooh, savage irony there. I'll get to the book in a minute. Lena Dunham, after Girls came around, oh, Lena Dunham is everywhere, including, what was this, at the Oscars or the Emmys, where she's shown naked, sitting on a toilet seat in a public bathroom stall, crying hysterically and eating. Because that big joke, if you saw Girls, and I think I watched the first 2 seasons, maybe the first 3, yeah, we're going to see a lot of Lena Dunham naked, and no one wants to see her naked. Oh, and she said in December 2016, Dunham declared on a podcast that she wished she'd had an abortion, explaining that she wanted to better understand women who have. The comment was widely condemned as insensitive. Dunham later issued a lengthy apology on her Instagram. Again, postulant. What sort of person would say such a thing? But in any event, so she writes this book, Not That Kind of Girl, and she gets into trouble. She gets into big trouble. And I wonder how much Random House lost on their $3.5 million advance, huh? She makes up a story about being raped at Oberlin College, and she describes this fellow who raped her, who is not the sort of person who goes to Oberlin College. No, not at all. She also describes molesting her 1-year-old sister when she was 7 years old. Yes, examining her sibling Cyrus's genitals. Cyrus wasn't named Cyrus at the time, when they were children out of curiosity, bribing them with candy for kisses and casually masturbating while lying in bed next to them. Williamson of National Review, Kevin Williamson, characterizes as sexual abuse, but Lena, Cyrus, and child psychologists, sexual abuse experts, and researchers in human sexuality have rejected this notion. I'm trying to remember the name of the singer, the once popular singer who is a lesbian, and gave birth to a child with David Crosby's sperm, because that's the sperm that you'd want. That's top-notch sperm. She confessed that she was introduced to lesbianism by her older sister. I wonder whether Wikipedia would consider that to be sexual molestation. But Lena Dunham, the years have not been kind to her. Not been kind. But the good news is Lena Dunham is back. Wow, she is back. It's a huge story. Cover story in the Hollywood Reporter, and here is her ugly fat face in a hideous outfit. They did a fashion shoot of Lena Dunham. Lena Dunham on her first film in a decade, youthful blind spots and hope to reboot Girls. The polarizing auteur, it actually says that, back at Sundance with sexual fable Sharp Stick, reveals how surviving hate, sickness, and addiction led to artistic rebirth. I'd love the next decade to be less about apologizing and just about openly making art. Well, that would be a first for her. The film that she was prepping in London was an adaptation of her favorite childhood book, Catherine, called Birdie, who was a 13-year-old English girl coming of age in 1190. And apparently the book is all about her first period. Yes, it's about a medieval girl getting her period. And of course, that would be Lena Dunham's favorite childhood book. Oh, by the way, I mentioned Lena Dunham's sister. Well, Lena Dunham's sister became a lesbian, which we all know is an immutable condition. Except now Lena Dunham's sister is her brother, now named Cyrus, formerly named Grace. And but wait, lesbianism is immutable. It's immutable. Well, no, it isn't. Everyone's sexually liquid now. No, but we were told for decades that one's sexuality is immutable, and that anyone who disagreed was subject to ferocious assaults. Many were canceled for this. But no. It's all liquid now. It's all liquid. And guess what? Cyrus Grace Dunham, as this person is now known, is now an acclaimed writer. How about that? It's funny how this works. No, America is not a hereditary oligarchy. Why would you ask? I'm just going to look through these. Oh, my God. Oh. Okay, you know the LBD, the little black dress? Well, Lena Dunham is modeling one of these, only there's huge cutouts. So you can see her vast stomach and her tattoos, and there's these huge buttons. You know what she looks like? She looks like a string of sausages. Each one is about to explode from its casing. That's what Lena Dunham looks like. Oh, look, more zany pictures of her. And she's, what are these, culottes? Are these just enormous shorts for fat people that she is wearing? Oh, and there's a picture of her with her mother and father and with her sister, who is now her brother. Oh, and yep, show us more skin, Lena Dunham. You know how Lena Dunham came about? Because our revolting postulant elite decided, you know what, just as an experiment, let's take a talentless, obnoxious woman and make her famous. And why would they do that? Because they can. It's that simple. And I guess Lena Dunham wasn't obnoxious enough, so later they decided to do the same thing with a person called Lizzo. And Lena Dunham, I don't know what to make of Lena Dunham's past relationship with a man called Jack Antonoff, who was a hit songwriter. Like he writes hits for people like Taylor Swift, who apparently is best buds with Lena Dunham. Sure, she is. It is now common in the music business for female singers to effectively sell their bodies for tracks, as they call it, because they want to be seen as auteurs too. So you want your name in the publishing credits. So women throw themselves at men like Jack Antonoff. But for some reason, Jack Antonoff was in a years-long sexual relationship with Lena Dunham. I don't know whether I believe that at all. And we're talking about horse racing now. We got to resurrect fat camps and call it public health. It can't be worse than what we got, says No Sleep Till Breezewood PA. More rolls than a bakery, says Dan. Kevin reaction video. Oh my God. Ugh, says Dr. Dead Name. I hated Girls even more because it replaced Luck, a show I really enjoyed, says Paul Casso 88. Well, these are distressing. This is distressing stories, but this is the culture. This is the culture. Melissa Etheridge, yes, that is the formerly quite popular singer, lesbian singer, who revealed, shamelessly, that she was introduced into lesbianism by her older sister. Her older sister. Hello to Teleologic Jones, who informs us that my great-great-grandfather drowned himself in the Thames. John S. says, Dunham's skin suits are quite ill-fitting. Anron says, quite a lot of Criterion spine numbers are in the for some reason category. If I like Scotch eggs, can I still listen to the show, says Teleologic Jones? By all means. By all means. I make no judgments. No judgments. And there's a bit in Alan Partridge where he's going to be doing an interview or something like this, and he's eating a Scotch egg, and it's given him this horrific acidic bad breath, and he says something like, it's going to take about 6 hours before this wears off, rather. Oh, and the Daily Mail has jumped on the Lena Dunham bandwagon. Lena Dunham wears daring cutout LBD as she discusses being body shamed by women, her desire to adopt. I certainly hope the authorities do not let that happen. I'll be 36 this year, she told the publication, The Hollywood Reporter. I don't feel like turning 38 without a child. Ugh. I suppose I could always buy one from Africa, like all these other famous people. It's a story in the New York Times, and apparently there's some big history about how this came about. Doctors debate whether trans teens need therapy before hormones. An upsurge in teenagers requesting hormones or surgeries to better align their bodies with their gender identities has ignited a debate among doctors over when to provide these treatments. A debate? There was no debate. Gender expression. You are going to affirm someone's gender expression, whether they're 18, 16, 14, 7, 5, or you will be canceled. But now the New York Times informs us that an international group of experts focused on transgender health last month released a draft of new guidelines, the gold standard of the field, that informs what insurers will reimburse for care. Many doctors and activists praised the 350-page document, which was updated for the first time in nearly a decade, for including transgender people in its drafting and for removing language requiring adults to have psychological assessments before getting access to hormone therapy. But the guidelines take a more cautious stance on teens. A new chapter dedicated to adolescents says they must undergo mental health assessments and must have questioned their gender identity for several years before receiving drugs or surgeries. Are they worried about lawsuits? Are they worried about the tsunami, the $1 trillion tsunami of lawsuits, which is coming their way? Both the charlatans who take part in this and the drug companies who make bank by producing the hormones. Speaking of expression, this is a story from the Post Millennial, and it is by James Anthony. A woman who was working as a substitute teacher posted a video to social media alleging she was fired by school officials for not identifying with a student who identifies as a cat after she refused to meow back at the child in class. Okay, I've got to rant for a minute, the teacher says in a TikTok video. Just when I thought school couldn't get any weirder, it did today. I'm a sub, and the most important thing we do is take roll so the school gets paid. So I'm looking at the seating chart as I'm going up and down the rows and marking who's here and who's not, says the TikTok user. And so I get to the third row and I hear this meow. Excuse me, she narrates. I start looking on the ground through the fourth row. Everything's good. Go to the fifth row. Everybody's there. Then I hear meow. I'm like, okay, what's up with that? Who's doing it? And this little girl in the very front row says, you have to meow back at him. He identifies as a cat. Are you kidding me? I said, is there a litter box in here somewhere? My sarcasm self, I probably should not have said that. He gets up and he storms out of the classroom, and I'm like, ruff. Of course, the entire class is laughing. I think, oh, no problem, no foul. I go to the office. Are you ready for this to check out? They said, we no longer need your services if you can't identify with all of the children in the classroom. And you wonder why they don't have any subs, the teacher explains. I told the lady, I said, I didn't know cats were considered people. I thought they were pets. Another school off my list, she concludes in her video. Well, the question about the litter box, it seems to me to be quite relevant. If a person would identify as a cat, well, then they wouldn't use a toilet. They would either, void their waste outdoors or indeed in a litter box. There's an essay at Revolver News about Elizabeth Holmes, girl boss, how a 19-year-old in a Steve Jobs turtleneck snookered America's failed ruling class. And this would be Darren Beattie. And he makes some very good points about America's ruling class. Specifically, America's ruling elites are screw-ups. For many, their only skill at all is having the right sex, skin color, or surname. Others once had real talent, but have aged into senility while refusing to pass the torch to others. And some have simply ruined themselves through decades of overriding their own common sense in obedience to an insane ideology that makes no sense. While this elite has not been able to shield itself from the full consequences of its failure, it certainly is not omniscient or omnicompetent. Today, the same class of people that fell for Theranos is falling for the idea that diversity is the military's greatest strength and that America needs more trans admirals to win the wars of the 21st century. They can blow $1 billion of their own money on an obvious scam, just like they blew America's military advantage on diversity and alphabet people, and just like they blew the CIA and FBI's residual credibility chasing after Russian collusion and Havana syndrome. And Beattie goes on to talk about the cryptocurrency meme coin or shitcoin phenomenon. Shitcoins are not some absurd deviation from an otherwise sound financial system that is responsibly and discernibly connected to the creation of real value. Quite the contrary. The absurdity of shitcoins does not represent an exception to the overall financial system, but a perfect crystallization of it. Lacking the narrative window dressing that affords other sectors of the financial system a patina of legitimacy, the shitcoin phenomenon affords us a naked and unvarnished glimpse into the scam that is our entire economy. Is the fact that it is possible to make billions from a dog coin any more ridiculous than the fact that a figure such as Elizabeth Holmes was able to ride the regime-promoted meme of women in tech to fool some of the most powerful men in the country, including the disgraced and pathetic General Mattis, into supporting and investing in her biotechnology company, Theranos, which is more absurd and outrageous, the Shiba Inu meme coin or the Elizabeth Holmes meme coin, so to speak. Oh, you may have seen this story about a judge from Massachusetts, and the judge's name is called Shannon Frison. And according to Associated Press, she is facing a domestic assault charge after authorities say she grabbed her wife by the hair and pulled her head back during an argument. And she was being arrested apparently she yelled out, "I'm a judge. Don't you know who I am? You can't do this to me." And so I looked to see pictures of this woman. She would appear that her whole body is, she has a shaved head, because of course, and it would appear that her entire body is tattooed all the way, sleeve tattoos on the whole arm, all the way right up to the knuckles. Yeah. And which raises the question, uh, are they actually breeding actual ghouls in Massachusetts now? Because this woman looks like a ghoul. She's, if you saw this woman coming towards you on the sidewalk, you would run against the traffic to get to the other side of the street. I'll just mention briefly a absolutely contemptible essay in the New Yorker called "A Daughter's Quest to Free Her Father's Killer." Katie Kitchen wanted to live up to her progressive ideals. Her own family tragedy presented a chance. Oh, look, a good news story. Katie Kitchen had always felt some sadness about the fate of the man convicted of murdering her father. On a summer night in 1991, Robert Hans came, a 77-year-old white, ooh, boo, real estate developer, had pulled into his garage in Houston's upscale Tanglewood neighborhood when an assailant robbed him at gunpoint, shot him in the chest, and then drove off with his wallet. 9 days later, police arrested a 20-year-old black man named Joseph, spelled wrong, of course, Dion White, in connection with the crime. At White's trial, Kitchen noticed his small stature and the mothers of his children sitting on his side of the courtroom crying. He had 4 children at the time, but then he realized later, he confessed, that there were actually 5. An emigre from Berlin who'd fought for the U.S. in the Second World War, Keim had an imposing build and a huge German voice, Kitchen said. Before he was rushed to the hospital, he told police that during the robbery, he'd refused to hand over his wallet. Kitchen, who was out of town that night and didn't reach the house until the next morning, sometimes imagined that her father scared the hell out of White, perhaps leaving him no choice but to fire in self-defense. Now 70, Kitchen is white-haired and voluble with a slight Texas accent and an understated personal style. Versed in the anti-racist precepts as such writers as Ibram X. Kendi, she calls herself a white woman of privilege from a very segregated world. During her childhood, a black housekeeper, Willie Lee, cooked the family's meals and lived in servants' quarters Monday through Friday. Kitchen's first husband, whom she married when she was 19 and divorced shortly before her father was killed, was the heir to an oil fortune. Today, Kitchen splits her time between homes in Austin, New York City, and Snowmass, Colorado. With the exception of a stint as a waitress at a Holiday Inn, she has never had a paying job. She recalled his fondness, this is the man who killed her father, his father, for sailing trips and jelly donuts, but at other times she spoke of his murder with an unnerving sense of perspective, as if her personal tragedy were an inevitable result of a broader societal reckoning. "I'm just so privileged that I can't imagine complaining about anything," she said. "We all lose our dads, right? Mine was to a violent crime, but then again, it just shows that I am part of this world. If rich old white people keep putting themselves on taller and taller pedestals, sooner or later, people are going to break down their walls." In other words, her 77-year-old father, who was shot in the chest, managed to get out of the car, crawl to the front door of the house, and smack his head repeatedly on it in an attempt to wake up his wife, who was sleeping. I guess dear old dad actually deserved it, deserved that horrifying death, because he was a boo white person. There's a piece a few days ago on Zero Hedge by Portfolio Armor called "Risking War with Russia." Clint Ehrlich tweeted, "The world is perched on the edge of an abyss. We may soon see the worst combat in Europe since World War II, killing thousands of people and raising the likelihood of nuclear war. It didn't have to be this way. What's happening? Russia has built up a potential invasion force on its border with Ukraine. Recent photos and videos show the Russian military pre-positioning attack helicopters and troop transports. It looks like a lot like final preparations for a cross-border assault. Why is this happening? Russia has issued an ultimatum. In the words of their deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, for us, it's absolutely mandatory to make sure that Ukraine never, never, ever becomes a member of NATO. The Russians insist that NATO expansion into Ukraine poses an existential risk to their security. President Putin argues that NATO missiles in Ukraine could hit Moscow within 7 minutes or even 5 minutes once NATO has hypersonic weapons. The US and its European allies have refused to assuage that concern. They insist that someday NATO will expand to include Ukraine, just as the alliance promised in 2008. And so, from Russia's perspective, negotiations have hit a dead end. The time for words is ending. This was all foreseen by the architect of U.S. grand strategy during the Cold War. George Kennan was the diplomat who devised our plan to contain the Soviet Union. After the USSR collapsed, he warned that expanding NATO would lead us toward war with Russia. Kennan called the first round of NATO's eastward expansion in 1998 a tragic mistake. He said that our differences during the Cold War had been ideological and that with the collapse of communism, it was no longer necessary to treat Russia as an enemy. It's the beginning of a new Cold War, Kennan predicted. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong. And there's an amusing piece by Julia Gorin at American Greatness called Avoiding War with Russia. And she relates a conversation with her mother about this. She's quite distraught about this idea. I somehow managed to drive to my mother's house. I told her that come the new year, we were going to war over Ukraine, the last straw for Russia of NATO's voracious expansion. Over Ukraine? She sneered in Russian. Listen, Russia is a crappy country, but a crappier country is Ukraine. For Ukraine to be a vital ally, you'd have to have no friends at all. This comes from a woman of Ukrainian Jewish blood who, like a lot of Soviet emigres, has always relished Russia getting even when it doesn't have it coming. Her revulsion for the place extends to these shores. She calls immigrants with still too much Russia in them, and she can spot them a mile away. How would you pronounce this? Nedoya Horshia, or not fully arrived, as if they're still on the plane somewhere between Russia and America. My Odessa-raised father shared her underlying hatred for the Soviet Union, where at 6 years old he gazed out at the Black Sea and asked my grandfather, how might one get away from this place? The look in my parents' eyes when American liberals would defend the USSR, often with, but you had the Hermitage, convinced me of every human being's potential to kill. In other words, I was raised a bona fide Russophobe, but the anti-Russia hysteria that has engulfed our confederacy of dunces is ridiculous and very dangerous. And you may have noticed that a lot of the laptop class have started putting Ukrainian flags next to their names on Twitter, like Colonel Andrew Coyne, who I'm waiting for him to slap on a tin hat and raise a brigade or a battalion to die for Donetsk. Oh, and of course, Canada's military is there. John Ivison at the National Post is rather disturbed by this. Canada's neglected military reaching point of being irrelevant. The problem is that lack of military capacity is not a political issue. Yes, our armed forces are a joke, a complete joke. How did our troops get to the Ukraine? Because we don't have the transport for it. We hardly have anything. But no, the Ukraine can rest assured that Canada is going to be there for them. There's been no talk of, Parliament about this, because when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, it seems to have been concluded, I don't know by whom exactly, that the Prime Minister of Canada has the plenary power to put Canada at war anywhere in the world for any reason or none. Let's talk. I'm going to talk about Peter Blackback in a couple of minutes. But last week I read a tweet storm from a fellow who calls himself Malmesbury Man about a speech that Eric Zemmour had given to journalists. He writes, Christiane Taubira, far-left former French justice minister, announced her candidacy for the presidency yesterday, further fragmenting an already splintered left. Zemmour responded with characteristically insightful and cutting remarks about her and the broader French left. Quote, the left is in the process of dying, and the left, that is to say, the left we have known since the French Revolution, is in the process of dying because very simply it has forgotten the French people. They only care about minorities, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities. Madame Taubira is the very incarnation of this betrayal of the French people by the left, so it doesn't surprise me. It's a very good candidacy to show definitively to the French people that left is no longer concerned with them and that it lives another life alongside the French people, apart from the French people, against the French people. And so, as I say, I'm going to be talking about Peter Blackback, but let's have a quick look at the chat. Gamian says Russia is an awesome country, especially compared to the U.S., most of which looks like the third world. Well, you know, the Russians are not too keen on sexually mutilating children, so that means that they're evil. That's one reason. The other reason why what the Never-Trumpers, the neocons, and their allies hate Russia so much, again, is ethnic animus, pure and simple. Julia Gorin, one has to salute her. But no, someone's great-great-grandfather was knocked about by Cossacks in 1881 in Odessa after the Tsar was assassinated. So that means that Russia is our eternal enemy. Justin Proto says we should admire and learn from our Russian cousins. They are of true metal, and I doubt USA's infantry dance troops are made of similar stock. Gamian says, incidentally, the testament to Russia's awesomeness is high internal tourism that skyrocketed in the past decade. Russian towns are well kept, safe, convenient to navigate, and have tons of history. Dr. Deadname says, I don't think they'll invade given the economic consequences. We keep hearing about more sanctions against Russia. Are there any more conceivable sanctions that could be levied against Russia? Nobody cares about the Ukraine, says Don Willis. Now with Uncle Joe in trouble, failing on the world stage, we need a skirmish? I think not. Jim Smith says lesbianism is immutable except for Shirlane McRae, that is Mrs. Bill de Blasio. Yes, what a curious story that is. Justin Proto again says Russia has $0 holdings, cash bonds, etc. This is a bad sign for peace. Respectable commenting name says the GOP has no constituents, only people they hate and dangle pointless social issues they still give up on in front of them year after year. Okay. People keep thinking Putin is going to bring back the USSR and keep saying this for the last 30 years or so. He's been ruling the place. Respectable commenting name says lesbianism in practice is proof KMG statement homosexuality is a behavior, gay is a radical political identity is true. Hello to Professor Paul Kakvaparshavaitia. So let's talk about Peter Blackback. Peter Blackback, who was born in 1951, is an American, although he has spent half of his life or more in Britain. He is a singer, songwriter, a musician, and an artist. And he is one of my favorite people in the world. His parents are well-known children's books writers and illustrators, Eric Blackback and Lenore Blackback. And so this happened a lot during Vietnam, that American parents didn't want their children drafted. So Blackback and his younger brother, Christopher, who is also a musician, were sent to St. Christopher's School in Letchworth. And it was there, one of his classmates was Anthony Moore, with whom Blackback formed the trio called Slap Happy, which is one of my very favorite art rock bands. Amusingly, one of the original members of the band at St. Christopher's School was a fellow called Neil Murray, who was like the heavy metal bass player's bass player. I played with Whitesnake and Gary Moore and Black Sabbath and Cozy Powell's Hammer and Peter Green. That's not heavy metal, but Michael Schenker group. Yeah. So I guess their artistic interests diverged. So Slap Happy originally, as Anthony Moore and Dagmar Krause, they originally formed in Germany, where they were associated with the, I don't know, the art rock scene there. Very strange avant-garde stuff. Slap Happy is not really all that strange. What did he call it? Like that, Douanier Rousseau, naivete. And they made a record for Polydor. And then they made a second. Oh, the first record, incidentally, has a song on it. It's called Sort of Slap Happy. Has a song on it called Blue Flower. And Blue Flower is kind of a hit. I guess it was covered by Mazzy Star. And it was also covered by an English shoegazer band. And yeah, hang on just a second here. I just bringing something up. The second record was re-recorded for Virgin Records. Now, a very long time ago, when Virgin Records first started, this is Richard Branson's record label. Richard Branson, by all accounts, despite making his initial money selling records, is not particularly interested in music. And so it was Tubular Bells that made the Virgin name, and Virgin Records came to it became a big rival for Island Records in the classy art rock field. And so the people who ran Virgin Records had pretty much carte blanche to sign, anybody, and they did. They signed people that they liked. Actually, the crazy German early industrial rock band that Peter Blackback was involved in is called Faust. And a very amusing story about Faust, in that Virgin Records had this idea that they could sell a lot of records by reducing the price. And so they released a record called the Faust Tapes. And it sold a lot of copies because it was, what do they charge? 49p? Yeah, they sold 49p at the time. And of course, much like Lou Reed's Metal Machine Music, a lot of these copies were returned to the store, the record stores, because there's something faulty with my record, because it's damaged, because this is just horrible noise. But the first two Slap Happy records were actually recorded with members of Faust. The third record that they made, the one that they had re-recorded, is called Casablanca Moon. Is a really beautiful record. No, actually, yeah, Slap Happy Casablanca Moon. It's pretty much, I guess you could call it, kind of skewed pop music. And the songs at that time were all co-written by Blackback and Anthony Moore. Moore, after Slap Happy disbanded, he had a solo career. And he later went on to, produce Kevin Ayers and write with Richard Wright of Pink Floyd and write with David Gilmour of Pink Floyd. To give you an example of the kind of wordcraft that Blackback likes to indulge in, here's a song, Michelangelo, lying back to paint upon the ceiling. No, he never uses black, just the colors of his feelings. He delineates saints on sepia ground. His temper, like his paints, is albumin bound. Work and toil, well, he ain't no dilettante. He conceives in oil and Vatican Chianti. The rumor's out, his hobby is dissection, and there ain't no doubt he knows the body to perfection. 14 lines, that's what makes a sonnet, and it even rhymes. Buonaroti's working on it. Through the streets, stricken by the urchins, wrapped in sheets round the town, he's lurching to the church, heavy with a vision, continuing his search, though they come with their derision. All his works, you just gotta see 'em, ask the clerks at your neighborhood museum. Pope's on the phone, calling Buonarroti, but he's not home. He's gone a little potty. He's off again, waving paints and brushes round the bend to wind up in the rushes. And there is a song about Arthur Rimbaud on that record as well. It's called Mr. Rainbow. And it begins in French with kind of close to gibberish lyrics. His silhouette rancid with diamonds, splinters like cone in the palm of your hand. He's rigged with a nebulae, a sine qua non, a festival of gas on a table of sand. He's jerking like an angel on the ladder of crime, diluting syrup ditties at the peak of their prime. He's spun like a ghost in the radio cool. He's everybody's child, but nobody's fool. He's cooked like the breast of a radio ghost. His name is Arthur Rainbow, and tonight he's your host. Well, no one would dare write lyrics like that anymore. As I think I've mentioned previously, in the past, it was considered a compliment to refer to a group's music or lyrics as being clever. Now that is a death sentence. It's an absolute death sentence. There is on the record, Casablanca Moon, there is the cream of English session men playing on it, including Clem Cattini and Dave Wintour. Their next record, Desperate Straits, was much, much different. It was an alliance with the art rock communists called Henry Cow. And I like this record a lot as well, except for the last song, which is kind of abstruse. But no, you could still call it a pop music, but it was really straining at the edge, you know. One of my favorite songs is called Bad Alchemy. I dream hermaphrodite and I sit up. This is the secondary meaning of hermaphrodite, meaning a binary man divided in half. I dream hermaphrodite and I sit up all night, our eyes on the horizon of a wobbling bowl. Heads in hands, we ponder dregs. The bowl contains a liquid's left putrescence after being drained. What we feel we have to solve is why the dregs have not dissolved. When I wake, I wonder what it means. Am I bad alchemy? It seems I image self unmixed, a risk in a dish for drinking, fluid with a strongly stinking sediment. Is that what it meant? Am I hermaphrodite, neither one nor quite the other? What we feel we have to solve is why the dregs have not dissolved. The gatefold, Desperate Straits, with beautiful artwork by Peter Blackback. Needless to say, these records didn't sell very much, and they were never released in North America, well, until much, much, much later on CD. Slap Happy was in charge, really, during the first collaboration, but Henry Cow was in charge in the second one, which is called In Praise of Learning. And there is, well, one song by Anthony Moore and Peter Blackback, the first one called War is Energy Enslaved, which is really quite good. The rest of the record is it's very, very heavy art rock, very long songs, which are communist rants. In fact, Blackback was fired from the band after he was asked to provide words for one of the Slap Happy songs. And he wrote something surrealistic, and he, in effect, he was told, "I don't think you're serious enough for this band." Blackbat admitted that the tunes that Henry Cow came up with were too hard for him to play. That the musicianship in Henry Cow was very advanced. Chris Cutler was the drummer in Henry Cow, and he and Blackbat have remained friendly. In fact, his record company, Recommended Records, which is an admirable effort, has put out many. They're the company that puts out Blackbat's records now. So after Slap Happy broke up, Dagmar Krause, who was married to Anthony Moore, she decided to stick with Henry Cow, which she did till the very end, and the spin-off band from Henry Cow. I once met Dagmar Krause in the radio station in Vancouver, and it was early days, and I could book anyone I wanted, and I heard that Dagmar Krause was coming to town. So I booked her on my show, where I'm sure the mostly elderly listeners of CGLR were quite bemused to be hearing a woman singing Bertolt Brecht songs on their talk radio station. She had just come out with a record of the songs by Bertolt Brecht and Hans Eisler. So Anthony Moore, as I said, made a solo career. He and Blackbat had this fascination for the American death song, you know, and I guess 10cc did too. Johnny Don't Do It, but Blackbat and Moore wrote a song called Johnny's Dead, which has a children's choir in it and is really quite delightful. But Blackbat was still signed to Virgin Records, and he made a remarkable record with John Graves, who was the bass player and pianist for Henry Cow, called Q Roan. And the singer is a woman called Lisa Herman, who has one of the most beautiful voices I've ever heard. Plangent, you could say her voice is. She never seemed to go anywhere, and I'm really kind of at a loss to understand why. This record, Q Roan, it's kind of a puzzle record. Actually, it contains illustrations, which Blackbat's lyrics are a comment on. To give you an example, Figure A, here are two gentlemen and a lady contemplating a length of dug-up pipeline. Figure B illustrates the assertion ambiguity can't be measured like a change in temperature. Figure C consists of a list of assorted equipage. A gentleman imagines how the items on the list would look if only part exhumed. He thinks they wouldn't look unlike a length of pipe. It's been noted that this record, Q Roan, was released the same day as Virgin Records' Never Mind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols. And this is quoted a lot. You know, a lot of old music died on that day. And the art rock of Slap Happy, Henry Cow, Blackbat, and more, yes, people had moved on. Although Robert Wyatt loves this record, as do I. It's a fascinating experiment, which was recorded in New York with avant-garde jazz musicians, including Carla Bley and Michael Mantler. And there's nothing like it. So, for some reason, Virgin Records decided that Peter Blackback was going to be the next Peter Gabriel. He had made a record, which is mostly produced by Andy Partridge of XTC, called The Naked Shakespeare, which is a beautiful and moving record. But then Virgin Records said, well, we need something more commercial. And the record called Nights Like This, which had Peter Gabriel's producer at the time. And if you really want to hear an example of atrocious 1980s production, where we're just going to do everything on the sampler. We don't need any musicians. We have a singer and we have a sampler, and we are just going to ram every musical point home. That record was not a success. He was dropped by Virgin Records. And so he went the indie route. His next record in 1988, called Downtime, was recorded on borrowed time from studios. No one's using the studio. You have a friendly engineer. He made a record in 1990, I think his best record, called King Strut and Other Stories, for Silvertone Records, a record label that no longer exists. And it has a song in it called Gold, which may be the most moving song I've ever heard. His lyrical approach had changed substantially after the failure of Q Roan. Compressed narrative in rhyme, as he calls it. You know, little stories. And I think it's as successful or more successful than his previous approach had been. Certainly more approachable. King Strut is, I suppose you could call, a kind of romanticized hints of heroic biography, a fantasized historic biography about a poor orphan who becomes the most powerful man in the world. It's really great stuff. There's a song on that record about creating characters, and the characters getting into terrible situations. And of course, the lyricist just walks away. But in the song, the characters complain. Why are you leaving us like this? As many characters in books might want to do if they had the opportunity to do so. And let's see, he continued to make records. He formed a trio with, again, John Graves for Chris Cutler, who'd been the rhythm section for Slap Happy. I particularly like the song Special Delivery from the record Just Woke Up. Everyone's too nice to me the way Vincent Price would be with Midnight Coming On. They say everything twice to me. They look at me in the eye and they say, we love you like a son. We love you like a son. But it's just sinister diplomacy, and anyone with eyes can see they're leading me on. Oh, soon it will come. Special delivery, though there's nothing to deliver me from. Blackback has been involved with Sid Straw, and he's complained, somewhat in a low-key manner, about how he's played with all these people who were famous but never seemed to get anywhere himself, musically. He was a member of the supergroup, the Golden Palominos, and Matthew Sweet does a fine job of singing one of his songs on one of their records. That would be, let's see, Blast of Silence. So Blackback has a parallel career as a writer and an artist. He worked on Peanuts backgrounds when he was in the United States at one point. And the London Independent, which was a much more highbrow newspaper then than it is now, he wrote a recurring comic strip in it called Leviathan. And there's a very handsome book version of this available. And Leviathan is about a boy, a small boy, and his toy rabbit and the existential adventures they have. It was very popular with independent readers. I I included a still from one of them on my Twitter page announcing this broadcast. That in one of them, essentially, uh, the the don't look back, right? You know, the Greek myth, and this is played out. That see, the joke is that it takes. This is true. We know for a fact that one of the reasons that children often put up such a fuss. I mean, small children, when they're put to bed, is that their brains aren't intelligent enough to realize that their parents aren't going away forever, that they're not being plunged into the dark and left alone. In fact, dogs never come to this realization, which is why they typically are so excited when their master returns home. So Blackback has continued his lonely, I suppose you could say, lonely career. The first two Slap Happy records were eventually released on one CD universally. It turns out that Slap Happy, well, they're big in Japan. Well, not exactly big in Japan, but they have enough fans in Japan such that it made financial sense to them to do a tour of Japan. And the Japanese fans, I think the Japanese fans must be the most loyal fans in the world. There was at one point a great deal of stuff on Japanese language websites about Peter Blackback. Blackback has made two spoken word records with Andy Partridge. The first one called Orpheus, the Lowdown. Of course, that's the Greek myth to which I referred earlier, and Gonewards, which are released on Andy Partridge's record label. And he has been taken up by the BBC, and he has written many radio dramas. In fact, he made a Slap Happy radio opera called Camera. He is interested in what they call pataphysics, and he has written extensively on this and published several books. Pataphysics is devised by Alfred Jarry, the French symbolist writer. Blackback is one of the most interesting people that I've ever come across, and his catalog of records, it really deserves examination. I should mention, to wrap this up, that so Dagmar Krause was on CJOR, and in the green room, she was there with her publicist, and I was walking towards them, and her publicist said, "Look, it was a terrible mistake to come on this show. No one is interested in you." So I walked up to her and I introduced myself, and I handed her the Slap Happy records on Virgin, and I said, "Could you autograph these for me, please?" The look on the face of the publicist was delicious. That's all I can say. He was quite bemused. So those are my thoughts on the great Peter Blackback. Cats don't seem to understand that either, says Anne Run. Well, I don't know. I mean, frequently a cat will, if it's hungry, it'll come running up to you. If it's not hungry, it's liable to not notice your arrival at all, just to, sleep wherever it's sleeping. A dancing band doesn't seem to like avant-garde types. Jeffrey Pye says Partridge is one of my favorites, but is best as his own writer than for others. He pokes at this in a fun recent appearance on the Prague cast. Hello to David the Gnome. Oscar Toe says, I've been listening to Lizzo. Love the beautiful nihilism of the beach house, says Teleologic Jones. Oh, yes. I know Beach House. Yes, of course. I do. Many musicians have high musicianship. Oftentimes, this does not amount to accessible music, says Dancing a Band. That reminds me of a joke from the web series Yacht Rock, about Michael McDonald and Steely Dan and the like. And there's somehow this movie, Footloose, gets dragged into it. And we learn that the original title, according to Yacht Rock, of Footloose was The Boy Who Danced Away Repression, which is a very good joke. A very good joke. I won't miss the sirens nor the gauche bedspreads, says Emma Nimpton. Well, neither will I, actually. Don Willis says, no, you are looking at it wrong. Think of those languid dates, drugs and alcohol in a cheap room in the Cheaton part of town. We've all been there, eh? Pardon my pedantry, death songs equal murder ballads, says Teleologic Jones. They're not all. They're not all murder ballads. Some of them are, a lot of them have to do with automobile accidents, or the American ones, or Johnny Don't Do It by 10cc. Blackback has a particularly strong one called In the Driver's Seat, which involves turning 18 years old. And what can you do when you're 18 years old? Well, you can drink legally, or used to be able to in the United States. So the narrator of our song is driving a big whale of a car down the street, tipping whiskey down his throat, and he doesn't see a bicyclist and runs over him. Dan says, LOL, love Yacht Rock. Pelcasso88 says, Michael Cimino almost directed Footloose. That is fascinating to think of. So that is the show for today. Tomorrow is Theater Thursday, and I am going to be talking about a movie I rewatched last night from 2008, written and directed by John Patrick Shanley, called Doubt. And it's about a Catholic parish in New York City in 1964 in the Bronx. And it has an all-star cast, Meryl Streep, who's tremendous as a ferocious old nun, Philip Seymour Hoffman as a, shall we say, go-ahead priest, and Amy Adams as a young, naive, and quite lovable nun who is torn between these two models. And so on Friday is the book club, and by popular request, I'm going to be discussing again a novel from, I believe, 1961 that I discussed on my old podcast years ago, and it is called The Wanting Seed by Anthony Burgess, the moral of which is don't anger God. And the next Music Monday, I'm going to be talking about the Mancunian melancholy of Joy Division. So that's it for today. I hope that I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to make a donation to the live stream, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And if you're in Canada, donations to the live stream may be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.